Today we are going to be solving some quadratics using completing the square. And so what we want to do is make this binomial that we have right here into a trinomial. So we're going to end up adding some number to both sides. And the way to figure out what number we need to add is we need to look at the middle term here, this 6 right here, this b term. And what we want are two numbers that add to make 6 that are both the same. Well, if they add to make 6 that are both the same, what we do is we take half of that number. So when you take half of the number, you get 3. So that's the number that goes inside the parentheses. So when you go ahead and factor this trinomial that I'll make really soon, it's going to end up being x plus 3 quantity squared. Well, we're not done yet. We need to take that 3 because what you do is you multiply the last terms, and so you need to square that number. And that's the number that we end up having to add to both sides. So this trinomial right here ends up factoring to what we have right there. And we go ahead and add the 9 to negative 5, and we end up with 4. So the whole reason for doing this is so that we could take the square root of both sides. And so when we do that, we're left here with an x plus 3 is equal to plus or minus 2. Plus or minus 2 because, you see, two numbers that multiply to make 4 could either be negative 2 and negative 2 or positive 2 and positive 2. So to find out the two values of x that make this the case is you just have to subtract the 3 from both sides. So when you do this, you're going to have 2 minus 3, that's the positive 2, and then you're also going to have negative 2 minus 3. So we end up with negative 1, because there's more negatives than positives, and negative 5. And what these represent are 2 points along the coordinate plane, along the x-axis on the coordinate plane. So if I was to graph this, what those answers represent are 2 points on the x-axis. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that would be 1 point, and the other point would be at negative 1. And then from there, it would just be a parabola that would end up opening up because it's a positive x squared. So that's what it means when we're trying to solve this for these x-intercepts. Let's take a look at our next one. Same thing, you're just taking half the b term, finding what two numbers add to make negative 8. And they both have to be the same number. Well, that's just negative 4. Well, you take that negative 4 and you square it, and that gives us 16. So that's the number you end up having to add to both sides. Now, what do we get when we have this trinomial as a perfect square? That's the whole reason for doing it. What goes inside? It's just the negative 4 that we got when we took half the b term. So x minus 4 quantity squared equals 25. Where did I get 25 from? Well, it's just the 9 and 16 being added together. You go ahead and take the square root of both sides. You're left with an x minus 4 equals plus or minus 5. So we're going to set up two problems here. See, we're going to end up having to add 4 to both sides. So we end up with this positive 5 plus 4, which is 9. And we have a negative 5 plus 4, which is a negative 1. So those are our two answers, negative 1 and 9. The two x-intercepts, two solutions, two roots. Couple different ways to represent that. And again, what it represents is x-intercepts along this x-axis. If I was to draw this, it would look something like this. So over one space on the left side, that's 1 point. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 spaces over, there's another point, and it's just a parabola that goes way down and then back up, crosses right there at positive 9. Well, taking a look at the next one, this is the hardest one that you'll see. You have one problem that has an odd number here, and this is why it's tough, because when you take half of an odd number, you end up with a fraction. And so here I'm ending up with 1/2. Well, I got to take half, and I've got to square that. And when I square that, I end up with another fraction, 1/4. And that's what I end up having to add to both sides of this equation. And so what we end up with is a factored form that goes x plus 1/2 quantity squared, because 1/2 and 1/2 add to make 1, but multiply to make a 4th. On the other side, come up with a common denominator. You could write this 30 and 1/4, but I want to come up with the improper fraction form. So what I'm going to do is multiply this by 4 and this by 4 as well. And so I end up with 120 over 4 plus 1 over 4. That gives me 121 over 4. And that's what I have on this side. So I'll go ahead and rewrite that, 121 over 4. And now I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. And so I take the square root, and when I do that, I'm left with this x plus 1/2 equals plus or minus 11 halves. 121, the square root of that's 11. The square root of 4 is 2. Well, at this stage, your denominators will be the same. Notice how they're both 1/2. So when I subtract 1/2 from both sides, there's no coming up with a common denominator. You just have 11 halves minus 1/2, and you have negative 11 halves minus 1/2. And so we end up here with a 10 halves, which makes 5. That's one of the answers. Over here we get negative 12 halves, which makes negative 6. That's the other. So 5 and negative 6, 2 x-intercepts, 2 roots, 2 solutions. Well, look at the next one. We've got ourselves a 2 as the middle term here, the b term. You're going to take half that number again. It gives you 1. You take that 1 and you square it. That gives us 1 again. So we're going to end up adding 1 to both sides of this. And so when we do that, we end up with a trinomial that factors down to x plus 1 quantity squared equals 22. Well, when we go ahead and take the square root of both sides, well, you take the square root of the left-hand side, but not the right-hand side so easily. So we're not going to approximate it. We're just going to leave it in terms of the radicals. So we've got x plus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 22. So we just have this one step of moving 1 to the other side. And when we do it, we write it as x equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 22. And that's the exact answer. We could approximate the square root of 22, call it maybe close to 5 or so, a little bit between 4 and 5, maybe like 4.7 or so. And then add that to negative 1 and subtract it from negative 1 to give us 2 answers. Taking a look at this one. Negative 10, you're going to take half that number because you're trying to find the two numbers that add to make negative 10. That'd be negative 5 and negative 5. Well, you take that negative 5 and you square it. That gives me 25, and that's the number that I end up having to add to both sides of this equation. So I go ahead and factor that. Factor to an x minus 5 quantity squared. This all equals 16 is what I get when I subtract those two numbers because they're opposite in sign. Take the square root of both sides. That leaves me with this x minus 5 equals plus or minus 4. So I go ahead and move this 5 back to the other side. I'm going to end up adding it to all sides. Leaves me with then x equals 4 plus 5, which makes the 9. That's one of the solutions. Negative 4 plus 5 gives me 1. So 1 and 9, the two x-intercepts, 2 roots, 2 solutions. And the last one here, again, the same sort of thing. You take the b term, and you're just going to take half of it. So half of 16 is 8. And so you're going to take that 8, and you're going to square it. That gives you 64. So 64 is the number that you end up having to add to both sides of this equation. We go ahead and factor, because that's what we do here. This trinomial will end up factoring as two binomials. Exactly the same numbers there, x plus 8 and x plus 8. And so it's a quantity being squared. And this all equals, add these numbers, we get a 6, a 9, and 6 end up giving me 15, so I get 156. And so I go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Now, you could approximate it, but we'll just leave it in terms of the radicals. So we've got x plus 8 equals plus or minus the square root of 156. So from that point, all I'm going to end up doing is just moving this 8 over. So I'm not going to subtract it from the 56, or 156 for that matter. I'm just going to rewrite this as two separate terms here. So I've got x equals negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 156. So those are some answers that we end up seeing here. And hopefully you end up having a little bit of success on your homework tonight. Problems look very similar. Good luck.